Okay. Well, the Bible study teacher got up yesterday, saw his shadow, and we've got about 6 more weeks of bad lectures. So we are starting to finish up week 9B of Luke. Last week we did 9A, which was the arrival into Jerusalem, and then started with some of the various challenges and things where they continued to test Jesus. This week, instead of being on defense, Jesus is going on the offense for the most part. So getting started. Whoops. The first section is called Beware of the Scribes, and in this section, he starts to call them out. He starts to, in front of a large crowd and in front of all of his disciples, he starts to address the scribes, and it is not unlike some of the events that we saw before, where he would kind of call people out as well too about their opulence and different things. But we've talked about the scribes many times, and we've always talked about how they might have been attorneys or lawyers and things, but just did a little more research and stuff. And basically, the scribes, they make up another group of individuals, and they still enjoyed some authority of leadership in Israel. They weren't just paid people or employees, but they were primarily associated with Pharisees and the high priests, and they also tagged along and were opponents of Jesus. The Mishnah also points out that they were presented as pre-rabbinic teachers with authority. And the reason why they called them scribes is because a lot of times they would sit there and duplicate the writings and the history, and also perform as teachers. And I'll talk in a minute about why I think that's kind of important, but scribes have a notable history in that all through time, all ancient people have had large numbers of scribes, mainly just for the sole purpose of being able to transmit or copy the religious texts. And if you've ever been on the Epcot ball in Disney, and they take you through time, there's one of the scenes where the scribes are all just lined up in rows, duplicating scrolls and documents and Bibles and things to be carried on throughout time. But one of the reasons why I think that's important is this really is a reflection of today too. You want your scribes to be honest and accurate and document what really is occurring. And there's a quote here from a famous book. We'll see if anybody recognizes it, but it says, "Whoever controls the past also controls the future, and whoever controls the present today controls the past." So it's kind of saying whoever's in power, they have the ability to write down what they want about the past, and by doing that, then they can also control or direct the direction of the future. Does anybody know where that quote came from? Well, that's from the 1984 book by George Orwell, and about Big Brother and things, how that comes through. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the scribes were pretty much one-sided, and they had their opinions and with the groups of who they were following. So it's probably a good thing that Jesus pointed out, be careful what these people say or provide to you, because they have the ability to write their own version of everything, and that can play a role in our future on where we go. So other gospel writers also thought this subject to be very important. Matthew and Mark also wrote about it. Mark's was almost verbatim to Luke's in the number of verses and the words that were written. It makes you wonder who copied off of who. But Matthew wrote extensively about the scribes, and had a lot more venom and warnings and curses and stuff in his. He wrote 36 verses versus, just the small handful that Mark and Luke had written. And but in Matthew's version, it says Jesus points out their need for opulence and their desire to sit at the best places to be praised, which is very similar to Mark and Luke's. But in Matthew, he goes even further and repeatedly, verse after verse, calls them hypocrites and fools and blind guides, and repeatedly says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." And all three of them call them out not only as being self-righteous frauds, but they also predict their humbling condemnation. I think Mark or Matthew even goes as far as indicating that there's going to be a place in hell for them. And it talks about their condemnation of their frauds and stuff is about stealing the homes of widows and other things. So again, they're using their position, their power, and what they call the law as their way to take from the poor and just keep fulfilling and giving to the rich. So the next section then goes in a little bit more where Jesus then also talks about the comparison of the rich and the poor. And the story is of the widow's two mites. And in Luke 21, verses 1 through 4, Jesus uses his observation of a widow's offering to further shame the scribes and the Pharisees. And in the temple of Jerusalem, let me skip ahead here one slide for a second. Here's the temple of Jerusalem. This is a modern day version of it, but a lot of the drawings and maps all show the same thing. This whole large area was the temple of Jerusalem. The tall structure in the rear, that's the altar itself. Inside is where they would do the burnt offerings and different things. The area that surrounds the altar, that was called the court of Israel. And the only people that were allowed in the court of Israel were the men, the Jewish men. Let me clarify that a little bit more. And then this big courtyard right here was called the court of women. And that's also the area where when people would enter this area would give their offerings. And surprisingly enough, though, as we can guess, the women weren't allowed back in here. But guess who else was allowed in the court of women? Does anybody have done any research on this? Do you have an idea of who might be allowed to hang out with the women? Well, this little corner right here was called the court of lepers. So it was perfectly okay for the lepers to go in there as well too. But what I thought was even more amazing is the large areas here on the outside, those were called the court of Gentiles. So it kind of gives you an idea of the size and the magnitude and the proportion of people that were in the city at that time. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Here's an example or a rendering of the trumpet or the coffers that people would come and drop their coins into here, and it would go inside the bank or in the wall and treasury where it would be collected in and kept inside. So I thought it was kind of interesting to have a picture to kind of understand the discussion of this. But Jesus watched as the widow walked up to one of the trumpets. Someone just arrived. Jesus watched as the widow walked up and dropped her 2 mites into the coffers. And he had been watching, the Pharisees and the Scribes and everybody as well. Logan, looks like you signed in again. Are you okay?
Yeah, I think we just lost connection for a minute and got kicked out.
Okay.
I got a question for you. Why would there need to be that much room for Gentiles?
I'm guessing that it's probably the proportion of, remember, anybody that's not Jewish is Gentile. So whether you were a Sumerian, Phoenician, Egyptian, any kind of race or origin other than Jew, there potentially could be a lot of them, is my only assumption. Because you remember back in some of those times, a lot of these areas were very much a mingled territory and things. They weren't all just Israelites living there.
So why would a Gentile even want to be there though? Like, was there markets, or was there, like, because if they didn't believe, why were they by the temples?
Well, I'm not so sure that they didn't believe yet, because you remember this was the birth of Christianity pretty much at this time. The Jewish religion and the Jewish temples were pretty much the only places of worship at that time. So also too, it's quite possible that remember too that was also the marketplace where people were going there to sell doves and goats and all those kind of things as well too. So my only assumption is that happened in that general area as well. But there weren't any Christian churches or Muslim churches or anything like that, at least not in Islam, I believe, at that time. So there wasn't many other places for them to go, and if that was the only place where they could show respect or worship God, then without any additional research, it's all I can tell you.
Yeah,
that'll be your 2 guys' assignments this week. So, okay. Well, anyway, Jesus watched all the Scribes and Pharisees make their offering. Of course, they were giving a fair amount of different things, probably doing their exact 10% or their tithing, and were very proud of themselves about what they were doing. But the widow walks up, and she drops in her 2 tiny copper coins, and these mites, they were the smallest Jewish currency. You remember last week we talked a little bit about Roman coinage and Jewish currency. Well, only Jewish currency could be dropped off in the church or in the temple, and but a mite, it took like 2 mites to be equivalent to the smallest Jew or Roman coinage. So every time we talk about money and stuff, a lot of times we try to put it in the equivalent to time or work. We've always talked about wages. Well, a single mite was the equivalent of about 6 minutes of an average day's wage. And so, in the grand scheme of things, the value of these 2 mites was very little. But what Jesus is pointing out is that she's giving everything she has. That's all she has. She probably had to save up to even make this big of a donation. And so she's donating 100% of everything she owns, even though she's in poverty. And one of the things I read points out, it says This woman has been supporting this temple and its corrupt system with her perseverance and true faith, despite having been ravaged by that very system. And Jesus, again, is focusing more on the proportion of what she's giving, which in this case is 100%, rather than the portion of her giving. And by this, he's trying to tell the scribes and everything that you guys could be doing so much more with the money that you're keeping and things. And so don't be so self-congratulatory because you gave a small portion of your revenue and your income and your wealth, because this woman is truly making a sacrifice for a religion that might not be treating her as good as it could. So, first question of the day. It says Jesus goes on the offensive in Luke's chapter 20, verses 45 through 21:4. It says, how does his commendation of the widow's offering function as a critique of the scribes? And how does it remind us not to confuse human wisdom as embodied by Jesus' opponents with God's wisdom as embodied by Jesus? So we've kind of partially answered it already, but let's focus on the latter part of that. How does it remind us not to confuse human wisdom with godly wisdom? And we've talked about some verses in the past that kind of ring true or in parallel with this. So any thoughts? Well, I don't remember which chapter and verse it was, but remember the some of the verses previously that I talked about how you can't take it with you, but you can pay it forward. You can build up your treasures in heaven by doing good and making sacrifices on earth. So this was another opportunity for Jesus to make the point of quit focusing on building up your wealth and start focusing on doing God's will with it and helping those in need. That's the take that I took from that part of the question. Anybody have anything to add?
Yeah, it's sort of looking at proportion there, as you said, I think, because the scribes could have given much more where she could not.
Right.
I'm having a hard time hearing what you're saying, Keith. Can you speak up a little?
I'm sorry, I've got a microphone here. I'll have to learn to get closer to it. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine. Can you repeat what your answer was?
Yeah, I said it's a sort of a matter of proportion, because the scribes could have given much more than they did, and she could not.
Yeah, she couldn't have given anything else.
Right.
Yep.
Well,
So then, go ahead. Sorry, Scott.
Jesus is suggesting that we need to see the entire picture. We see somebody giving a lot versus somebody giving a little. If you don't see the whole picture, you just see the act, you don't get a sense of the proportion.
True.
Yeah, it's putting it in context, I think, is the thing here, and you kind of wonder about that today. Is, you know, how many people don't give anything when they can, and you know, there's a lot of angst and stuff about sometimes people just come to church and go to church and then they don't do anything with it. They don't donate, they don't give their time. Those that normally can't give money sometimes will donate a lot of time to different events and that kind of stuff. And even that can be a proportion as well too. So yeah, I think that's something that's been going on through time from way back when to is very appropriate to consider that and look at that today as well too. The next few sections is starting to discuss where Jesus makes multiple predictions. He starts to predict the destruction of the temple. He kind of repeats a lot of the predictions that he's made in the past. He'll go on to make some predictions about his activities that are to come, the second coming of man as well. And so he describes again the temple, about how it will be destroyed, and that again there will not be one stone remaining on top of another. And then when he starts to discuss the end of the age, or the second coming, the disciples are saying, okay, well, how are we going to know when that end is near? And I'm reading between the lines here a little bit. I know that the disciples are, for the most part, are very devout followers, but you kind of wonder if they're looking for the signs, so that just in case we haven't been doing the things that we should, it'll give us an opportunity to know it's coming and make amends and get caught up, so to speak, in things. And I kind of think about that sometimes when I'm going to the doctor and checking my blood and things like that. I think, well, I'll work hard this month before I go to the doctor so I can have some good stuff to report. This kind of reminded me a little bit about that. And, maybe the disciples are not so sure that they're ready, and that they want to make sure that they can see the signals, even though Jesus describes that they should be pretty obvious. But he describes multiple events, and this time I'm not going to write all the answers down here, but he describes specific treatments that are also going to happen to the disciples and the other followers of Jesus. And we'll talk about that when we get into the questions. But I guess in retrospect, some of these things did happen to the disciples that Jesus predicted, but they may have occurred out of order. Some of the treatments and things that happened to the disciples happened before the chain of events that Jesus described. So I kind of wonder if the disciples kind of felt like, well, you know what, we didn't get all the signals that he promised us, or the signs, and they just skipped step one and went right straight to step two, and here I am. So we'll discuss that a little bit more. In question 3a, it says, here Jesus gives more detailed teachings about two events: the destruction of Jerusalem in verses 43 and 44, and his second coming. And by the way, it was chapter 19, verses 42. These are looking back. Chapter 9, verse 26 is very similar, and chapter 17, verses 23 through 37. These are kind of recurrence or repeats of some of his previous predictions. But according to chapter 21, verses 5 through 24, what things must take place before the end? That is, before Christ's return. And note, some of these things are ongoing even today, while some occurred with the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So there was a lot of things that were listed. Can you start to repeat or recite some of the things that he predicted would happen, or events that would occur?
Wars, famine, earthquakes, unusual tides, plagues, persecution, Jerusalem surrounded.
Yeah, the couple of more that I had too is he said there would be a lot of appearance of false gods and stuff, that people that would claim to be him as well. And then I had also written down that there would be a lot of sights and great signs from heaven.
Why didn't he just tell them, guys, you're not going to live to see this?
Well, I think the timing and stuff is somewhat dictated by how we react or act as men. I think sometimes, you know, if that was the case, he could have done it before he died. I think the goal here was to see how they could take this news, and would they use it to make themselves and the world better, or what? As we look back through time, God has often not done things until the last minute. I mean, when you look at like the floods of Noah and time, and the destroying Salem and things. Things just had to get really bad before he finally said, "I've had enough. Let's do this." And I think part of his goal too is if he told them, "You're not going to see this," what would likely be the reaction of people? If people said, "Hey, the world's not coming to an end before I die," then why don't I go ahead and party and drink and do all the things that are evil? And if they don't think it could happen any day, you tend to react different or approach life in a different vein. If you think you've got another 30 or 40 years, just like I said, going to the doctor. I don't always eat the best when I know I'm not going to the doctor next week. So
Well, our motivation to be good Christians isn't because we think the world's going to end next week or the week after or the month after or 2 years from now.
right, but your motivation is that it doesn't matter whether it's just your death by itself or the death of the entire planet. Your motivation is to make sure that when your time comes, you're going to be ready.
Well, Ken, do you have any insight into verse 32 then, where it says, "I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass from the scene until all these things have taken place." That almost sounds to me like Jesus is saying to them, this generation, you guys that are there on earth right now, are going to see all this stuff.
No, I don't have any insight.
You see the temple destroyed.
Well, and to some degree, it wasn't really a true war or whatever, but there was this ongoing, even though it was peaceful, there was this ongoing conflict between the Romans and the Jews and the various people around. I mean, it wasn't a true battle, but there were some nations kind of against nations. It's just that Rome won for the most part. But I don't have a better explanation about why all these things didn't happen within the next 20 years. But
Because above that, prior to that, it shows that Jesus was saying the Son of Man will return. So to me, it was indicating that they were going to be there on earth and see Jesus return and see all that tribulation and so forth. And that's not the way it really happened. So that was confusing to me. I had a big question mark there in my Bible, just waiting for you to get here.
well, it's been 2,000 years now plus, and it still hasn't happened yet. But I tell you, you watch the news or read a newspaper and things like that today, and sometimes you look back and wonder if, and I also think too, is when we had the world wars and that kind of stuff, can you imagine the fear and the trepidation of people that thought that this was step one that was going on, and that I mean, there was a lot of horrible things that went on during World War I and World War II. To some degree, there probably was some famine and pestilence, and seemed like things were coming down out of the heavens and everything else. I mean, I could imagine that there's been a couple of events in the past that people thought that the second coming was coming. But why it didn't come during the lives of the disciples, that I cannot explain. There's a lot of things that when we go to study the book of Job, that one of the reasons why we want to study that is because we're trying to understand why God has done or fails to do some things for people, and some things there's just no explanation of other than it's God's will, and we have to trust Him that maybe He just decided it wasn't time after all.
Okay, thanks a bunch.
Okay.
On the question of being ready, do you think perhaps that might have something to do with our reward in heaven? In other words, what we build on here, it's in Corinthians there somewhere, which says, if we build on Him, but if we build on hay and stubble, it'll all be subject to test by fire. And if our works are burned up, we still will be saved, but just as if out of, through fire. And I'm thinking, that's going to determine what our reward might be.
Yeah, Keith, I'm not sure. I think what you're saying is did they do enough on earth or whatever, or were they ready?
It's not earning our salvation.
Our
salvation has already been earned, but our reward has yet to be given in heaven.
A little closer, Keith.
Okay, I'm sorry. I got too relaxed there. I said, it's not, our salvation has already been determined. So this has nothing to do with our salvation, but we're going to be rewarded when we get into heaven. And I'm thinking that we can still be prepared by what we do in building our lives on Christ while we're still on earth here, in order to get our reward when we get to heaven. So works, I think, could have a bearing on our reward.
So you're saying the size of your room depends on what you do?
I'm sorry, repeat that.
I said, are you saying the size of your room in heaven depends on what you do here on earth?
Possibly. I mean, I know, we are to receive reward, and I think the Bible speaks to that somewhere, so far as reward might perhaps be different, but I can't give you a scripture now.
Did we lose Ken?
You're just showing on the screen. Yeah, we lost Ken.
You guys ask too many tough questions.
Okay.
That's all that is. I'm sitting here thinking, listening to your guys' questions, and I'm thinking, boy, I'm glad I don't teach that class anymore.
Hey, one thing we have to realize through this whole time that Jesus was with us on earth, Israel as a nation was not at war. I think a lot of us kind of forget the fact that they were a nation that was always in some type of a struggle, some type of a physical altercation with another nation. So they were pretty well at a peacetime when Jesus came. So that kind of changed their mindset on different things. I kind of agree with Keith a little bit of our heavenly reward. How is that given, or how is that earned, or how is that received? I don't know if, you know, if that all in jewels of our crown, or the size of our mansions, or how that entails. But I do know that the ones that God has called into ministry, whether it be teaching or preaching, will be judged on a different level than others. I believe that. Even in the book of James, it warns people who are teachers to be very careful of how you teach and what you teach, for you'll be judged differently. So I think you put that kind of all in the same perspective. You know, I think also too, with the 2 mites that the widow gave, was the fact that Jesus had nothing earthly to give, but what he did give was everything that he had. So that kind of puts that all in a nutshell.
Well, the Jews may not have been at war, but they were under Roman occupation, right?
Yeah, they were still under Roman occupation, but the fact was they weren't actually in a physical war where they were out, you know, having soldiers out and people being killed or people being held captive or things of that nature. I mean, they were never really under their own rule, but they were not at quote unquote war. They were more out of a peacetime.
I think Ken's back now.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about that. Lost the internet, and thank you, Tom, for taking over like a true Sunday school teacher. Thank you. Keith, I think you need to hold that mic right up next to your mouth.
I know. It's a long, slender thing. I'm afraid I'll punch it in my eye.
You need Marie there. She'd hold it.
All right. She'd hold me up to
it. She's got a big room in heaven.
Right. Well, I think so.
Okay, well, let's we got about 15 minutes here, so let's go on. Then Jesus also talks even more about the second coming, and verses 25 through 28, he describes, now he starts to give the disciples some of the signals of what will come, and some of these things he describes are being cosmic or astrological in nature. He discusses some of that the world population will have great anxiety and stress, and that could cause its own share of stress and medical ailments. There'll be some forms of supernatural events as well too. But what he's describing is similar words or whatever that echo the prophecies that were also described in Daniel 7:13 and Revelation 1:7. So question 3b says, according to Luke chapter 21 verses 25 through 27, in detail describe what some of these events will be that will be associated with Jesus' return.
There'll be strange signs between the sun, the moon, and the stars. There'll be turmoil, roaring seas. I can't read my writing on this last one.
Strange times.
I said no. Oh, I didn't. You're right.
I thought it was interesting. One of the things it mentions there is the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And there's a footnote on Mark 13:25, which expresses it this way. It says, all the forces of energy that hold the stars in place will be removed. In other words, there will be total heavenly chaos.
Yeah, because I wondered what some of the cosmic signs. It just says there will be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and that by itself really wasn't very descriptive and stuff. You know, could an eclipse be construed a sign from the heavens? I mean, for the Egyptians and the Phoenicians and stuff, it certainly was. All through the ages and things, the Mayans and the Aztecs and everybody all put great fear into events like that. But yeah, I hadn't heard or read that footnote that you mentioned, Keith, about total chaos. But that almost sounds like, you know, planets and stars and meteors and everything else just crashing into each other.
Just loosen everything that's holding it together.
Right. It's like gravity is no more, and the planets are not going to go around in a circular motion. And I kind of wondered if maybe the flat earthers were finally going to get their wish.
I wonder who that is.
I don't know. I know somebody who used to be a flat earther.
Used to be?
I don't know. Well, I think I finally got her. I said, if the Earth was flat, why wouldn't the eclipse be a stripe on the moon instead of a? And she raised an eyebrow. So I don't want to spend any more time on that. But yeah, it also talks here about how men's hearts are going to fail. So there's going to be mass heart attacks, I guess, too. Just because the people that can't deal with the stress of what's going on and the fear of, you know, what could happen to them and their families. But then, yeah, and the heavens shaking and stuff. And then it also says, then the Son of Man will be coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And it says, then, now when you see these things, now you should look up and lift up your head because your redemption draws near. So, and this is one of those sections that we talked about before, how a lot of times people will pick and choose the sections and the verses out of the Bible that they want to fit their narrative. And you kind of wonder how many times have, like we said with the world wars and stuff, how many times have people seen events and things and said, well, that's could be it, and different things. Tornadoes, tidal waves, all kinds of things like that happen over time. There could be a lot of people that even this pandemic, people could wonder, you know, is this the men's heart stopping and things. So there's a lot of interpretation on these signs, that's for certain.
That means physically hearts will fail? Because I kind of took it, like my version says, people will faint from terror and apprehensive of what is coming. So I just kind of thought that it meant that they won't be strong in their faith.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because the version that's in mine says men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. So in New King James Version, that doesn't sound like I'm giving up. You know, I'm going the other way. It almost sounds like they're being reverent and collapsing the stress of that because they know it's coming and maybe they're not ready. I don't know.
Mike thinks what you think, Ken. I didn't think that, honestly. I thought it was that they were weak and terror took over and their strength failed them. I didn't get that their physical heart failed them. But I can see it both ways.
Yeah.
My Bible just says they're terrified.
Well, the other thing my study Bible adds, it doesn't go into great detail, but it says these will cause great anxiety among the world population. And, anxiety can have a lot of effects on people, whether it be stroke, heart attacks, or who knows. But that was just my interpretation, that some people aren't going to be able to handle the stress or the messages, is the way I interpreted it. Again, that's what anybody can interpret these the way they want. No, there's no right or wrong answers.
Right, and both are probably good. They're probably
Yes.
both.
Well, they both have a very similar message, and it goes back to what Jesus said or what we're getting ready to cover is being ready. If you knew exactly where you were going and what it was going to be like and things, and you saw all these signs, for someone that's ready, this could seem like we're getting ready to go on vacation. But for some that aren't ready or whatever, this could be, I've got a lot of work to do, and I don't know if I can get it done in time. So I think the messages are very similar.
Yeah, one thing too, Ken, when you think about you're actually putting your own physical life in jeopardy, and that's what Jesus is kind of telling them by their own individual accounts of this stuff. You put people, we talked earlier about when Israel seemed to always be under someone else's suppression. They could take that because they had life. They could take it because they knew that they were going to get up the next day and be able to, to still have life. And that's even with people in prison systems. You wonder how people can do what they do, is because they know that they have, they do have their life to an extent. And now Jesus is telling them that has changed, because now it's all more on a more personal, individual basis. So I think that was really difficult for them to understand, because now they are in charge of their own things, and before they were just part of the group.
Yeah, because which direction they go is entirely based on their actions and that they've made through time, and not on the will of others. Okay, we got about 5 minutes to go here. The last section that we'll talk about, and as we just said, is building up to this, is the importance of watching. And in verses 34 through 36, he tells a similar message that he had shared with everybody, and we discussed it previously in Luke chapter 12, 39 through 40. And in the interest of time, I don't know if anybody remembers, but there was a parable or a story that says, if you know when a burglar is going to come to your house, well, you're going to wait until the night before or whatever, and you're going to prepare for that to protect your home. But if you know that there's going to be a burglar coming someday, but you don't know what day it is, or week, month, year, whatever, you're going to prepare and always be ready. So he's saying the same thing over again, just in a different context or in a different fashion, that you don't know when it's going to happen. You may not see the signs, but also too, just like we talked about with the disciples, some of them are going to pass before the signs and things. So you always have to be ready for that day, whether it's you or everyone. And he goes on to say that those who are focused more on the pleasures or the worries of this life will be caught off guard when Christ does return. And again, that kind of goes back to what we just talked about being ready and stuff. Is quit focusing on building your fortune or constantly partying and things like that. But by the same token, too, you can't sit around and stress and worry about things in life either. And I was going to say that when we have our discussion about Job, but just to give you a little bit, our time on earth is just a pixel on a big screen or whatever when you compare eternity and everything. So spend that time just trying to live a good life and be ready for the other billions and millions of pixels. So he goes on and gives specific instruction about what the actions the believers should take to be ready. And just kind of closing out that section, which I thought was kind of odd. It's like he took a little detour here, Luke did, and in verses 37 and 38, they have very little to do with the importance of watching. But in those verses, it just describes his daily actions of, we talked about that a little bit, that he would go down into Jerusalem and teach at the temple during the day to all the people that wanted to hear him. And then he would go back to the Mount of Olives or Bethany area at night to retreat and, possibly to stay safe. But it's kind of the conclusion of the end of that section. But it's just a couple of those verses that got thrown in there that you wonder, what did that have to do with the subject line?
Do you think maybe those two verses should have been at the beginning of the next chapter?
Yeah, or even at the beginning, 2 chapters previously when he first entered. But yeah, it's almost like I forgot to mention this, and they wrote it down. But like we said, Luke was kind of notorious for just writing down details and not necessarily getting them in the right order. Kind of wonder if he didn't have a little bit of Asperger syndrome or something, that he just write things down as he remembered them, and thought he would make them chronological later, but he didn't. So final question of the day says, what should followers of Jesus do to prepare for the coming judgment? In verses 34 through 36. I described a couple of them, but there's one thing I didn't mention.
Be in prayer, be aware, be watchful.
Right. Yeah. What I was looking for is always be prayerful so that you can stand in front of Jesus with your head held high and know that you've done all you could so that you're ready when he comes.
Now it says we should pray that we have the strength to escape all these things. I don't know what his definition of escape would be there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I was just trying to look at my Bible to see where the escape part is.
That's what mine says.
Yeah, New King James Version just says, watch therefore and pray always that you may be counted worthy. Oh, mine does say to escape all these things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. So, yeah, that is very similar. Well, my clock says it is 10 o'clock. Next week, read Luke 22:1 through 22:65, and we're only going to get halfway through week 10. Questions 1A through 2C. I believe that's about 5 questions. These scriptures describe the plot to kill Jesus, the preparation of his trials, and his arrest in Gethsemane. So, with that, Scott, would you mind closing us out today, please?
Linda's going to.
Okay, great.
Our Heavenly Father, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to gather together to study your word. It's amazing that your word has endured through scrolls and paper and now to Zoom, but you're still with us. Thank you for Ken's leadership. Thank you for giving us opportunities to learn about your return, that we have hope for the future. Bless us all in the coming days this week and help us to bring glory to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.
See you later.
Thanks, Tom.